The man behind the spotlight. The spotlight always loved Dean Martin. It followed him the way the moon follows the tide, quietly, faithfully, never asking permission. On stage, he looked untouchable, effortless. The kind of man who could lean into a microphone, smile once, and make an entire room feel like it had been waiting just for him. But what most people never noticed, what the applause drowned out, was that Dean always turned around before he left the stage. Every night, not to wave, not to bow. He turned to look at his band, especially the guitarist. His name was Frankie Bell, and unless you were close enough to the stage to see the whites of his knuckles or the tremble in his fingers, you'd never know how much he mattered. Frankie didn't shine. He held the shine together. One, the quiet man in the shadows. Frankie Bell had been with Dean for nearly 8 years. 8 years of smoky lounges, late-night television sets, neon hotel signs flickering through bus windows, and applause that felt like a warm wave, if you were standing in the right place. Frankie usually was. He sat slightly behind Dean, angled just enough that the camera never quite caught him unless it was supposed to. His guitar rested against his chest like a second spine, something he leaned on more than he admitted. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. His hands spoke fluently. Every pause Dean took between lyrics, Frankie filled it. Every note that needed warmth instead of volume, Frankie knew. Every moment when the song threatened to tip into excess, Frankie pulled it back. Dean trusted him completely. Which is why, on a cold rehearsal morning in Los Angeles, something felt wrong. 2, a missed note. The studio smelled like coffee and old wood, familiar, comforting. Dean had arrived early, humming to himself, coat draped loosely over his shoulder. He greeted the crew with nods and half-smiles, already in rhythm with the day. The band started warming up. Drums, bass, piano. Then Frankie's guitar joined in. Or tried to. The note wavered. Just barely, but enough. Dean stopped humming. Frankie frowned, adjusted his grip, tried again. The second note wobbled too. No one else said anything. No one ever did. Musicians had pride. Mistakes were handled privately, buried under professionalism. But Dean raised a hand. "Hold on," he said gently. The room froze. Frankie looked up, startled, like a man who'd been caught thinking out loud. "Sorry," he muttered, "just cold fingers." Dean studied him. Frankie's hands were trembling. Not from nerves. From something deeper. Dean had seen fear before. He'd worn it himself in earlier years, when doors didn't open, when money ran thin, when the future felt like a rumor. This wasn't stage fright. This was pain. 3, after the rehearsal. When rehearsal ended, the others packed up quickly, joking, laughing, heading toward lunch or other commitments. Frankie stayed behind, carefully placing his guitar back into its case, slower than usual. Dean lingered. He pretended to look for something in his jacket pocket, waited until the room emptied, then spoke. "You all right, pal?" Frankie hesitated. That pause, just a second too long, said everything. "I'm fine," he said, "just tired." Dean didn't push. Not yet. He lit a cigarette, leaned against the piano and changed the subject, talked about the set list, about a joke that hadn't landed last night, about nothing at all. But as Frankie turned away, Dean noticed something else. Frankie winced when he lifted the guitar case. Just slightly. But Dean saw it. For the truth slips out. 2 nights later, in a hotel lounge dimly lit by amber lamps and quiet conversations, Dean found Frankie sitting alone. No guitar. No drink. Just a cup of lukewarm coffee and a stare aimed at nowhere. Dean slid into the chair across from him. "You ever notice," Dean said casually, "how coffee tastes worse when you don't need it?" Frankie smiled weakly. "Guess so." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Dean said it. "You're hurting." Frankie opened his mouth to deny it. Closed it again. His shoulders dropped. "It's my hand," he admitted. "The doctor says it's nerve damage, been getting worse." Dean's jaw tightened, not visibly but enough. "What happens if you don't fix it?" Frankie laughed once, bitter. Then I stopped playing, simple as that. Dean stared at him. And the surgery. Frankie looked down at his cup. I can't afford it. The words landed quietly. But they echoed. 5, pride is a heavy thing. Frankie explained quickly, like a man afraid the truth might get bored and leave if he didn't rush. Insurance wouldn't cover it fully. The cost was high, the recovery uncertain. He had a family back home, bills, a roof that didn't care about talent. I'll manage, Frankie said. I always do. Dean leaned back in his chair. He didn't say a word. But inside, something shifted. Dean Martin had grown up knowing what it meant to count coins, to weigh pride against survival, to pretend everything was fine because admitting otherwise felt like failure. He recognized that look in Frankie's eyes, the look of a man already preparing himself for loss. 6, a question that changed everything. Dean stood up. You hungry? He asked. Frankie blinked. What? Food, you look like you forgot it exists. They ate, talked about old gigs, about nothing important. And then, just before they parted ways, Dean asked a question that seemed harmless on the surface. How long before the damage becomes permanent? Frankie swallowed. 6 months, maybe less. Dean nodded. Good to know. That was all he said. Frankie watched him walk away, confused, unaware that something enormous had just been set in motion. 7, Dean makes a call. Back in his hotel room, Dean didn't turn on the television. He picked up the phone. He called his manager. Then his lawyer. Then someone else entirely. Each conversation was short, precise. No drama. No speeches. Just decisions. When he finally hung up, Dean sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, staring at the wall. Fame had given him many things. This time, he intended to use it quietly. 8, the calm before the storm. The next rehearsal went smoothly. Frankie played through the pain, smiling, professional as ever. No one suspected a thing. But Dean watched him more closely now. Counted the seconds between songs. Noted the way Frankie flexed his fingers when he thought no one was looking. The clock was ticking. And Dean Martin hated clocks, the offer that was never meant to be refused. Frankie Bell had always believed that the most dangerous sound in the world wasn't silence. It was sympathy. Sympathy made people careless. It made them offer things they didn't fully understand, and made men like Frankie feel smaller for needing them. That belief had kept him alive for years. But it was about to be tested. One pain learns to hide. Pain is clever. It learns routines. It memorizes smiles. It knows when to stay quiet. By the 3rd week after that late-night conversation in the lounge, Frankie's pain had learned exactly how to behave. It waited until the applause faded. Until the lights dimmed. Until no one was watching. On stage, Frankie played flawlessly, almost better than before. There was urgency in his notes now, a sharpness that made the songs feel more alive. Audiences didn't know why, but they felt it. Critics called it raw emotion. Frankie called it survival. Off stage, his right hand burned like it was holding fire. He rapped it at night, stretched it until his teeth clenched, took breaks he never admitted to. Every morning he tested his fingers the same way, slowly, carefully, terrified of what they might refuse to do. And every morning they obeyed. Barely. 2, Dean watches without asking. Dean Martin noticed everything. He noticed the way Frankie sat, instead of stood during breaks. The way he avoided handshakes. The way he always packed up last now, buying himself time. Dean said nothing. Not yet. Experience had taught him that timing mattered more than generosity. Push too early, and pride digs in like concrete. Instead, Dean adjusted the set lists, fewer demanding transitions, more breathing room. He took longer pauses between songs, joked more, filled the space so Frankie didn't have to. To everyone else, it looked like showmanship. To Frankie, it felt like mercy he hadn't asked for. And that made him uneasy. 3, the envelope. It happened in Chicago. Backstage smelled like old curtains and sweat. the kind of place where history lingered whether you wanted it to or not. The show had gone well, standing ovation, encore demanded the usual magic. Frankie was wiping down his guitar when Dean approached. No jokes. No cigarette. Just Dean. He held an envelope. Thick. Unmarked. Frankie, Dean said softly, walk with me. They stepped into a quieter corridor. The noise faded behind them like a door closing on another world. Dean handed him the envelope. Frankie didn't take it. What's this? He asked. Open it, Dean said. Frankie frowned. Slowly he did. Inside was a single piece of paper. A name. A clinic. A date 2 weeks away. And below it, a receipt. Paid in full. Frankie's breath left him all at once. The line Frankie wouldn't cross. I can't accept this. The words came out fast, too fast, like he'd rehearsed them. Dean didn't react. You haven't even finished reading. I don't need to, Frankie snapped, then softened his tone. I appreciate it, I really do, but I can't. Dean leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Why? Frankie laughed, a short, humorless sound. Because I'm not a charity case. Dean's eyes darkened, but his voice stayed calm. You're not? Then don't treat me like one. There it was. The line Frankie had drawn years ago, carved deep into his identity. I earn what I keep, I lose what I can't hold. Dean took a step closer. This isn't charity, this is investment. Frankie shook his head. No, this is you fixing something you didn't break. Dean exhaled slowly. Frankie, you break that hand, this band changes forever. And if I take your money, Frankie shot back, I change forever. Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Unforgiving. The truth beneath the anger. Frankie's voice dropped. You know what it feels like, he said, to grow up knowing every favor has a cost. Dean stiffened. You know what it feels like, Frankie continued, to watch your father accept help once and never forgive himself for it. Dean said nothing. Frankie pressed on, emotion rising. If I let you do this, I don't know where I stop being your guitarist and start being your responsibility. The words hit harder than Frankie intended. Dean straightened. You think I'd hold this over you? No, Frankie said quickly, I think I would. That was the truth. And truths were dangerous things. Dean's voice finally breaks. Dean's calm finally cracked. Not loudly, not violently, but enough to be unmistakable. You think this is about me feeling generous? He asked. Frankie looked up. Dean's eyes were sharp now. This is about me refusing to watch a good man lose everything, because he's too proud to let someone stand beside him. Frankie swallowed. I didn't ask. I know, Dean cut in, that's the problem. Dean took the envelope back and tucked it into his jacket. Think about it, he said. You don't owe me anything, not gratitude, not loyalty, not silence. He paused. But if you walk away from this, you're choosing pain over possibility, and that choice will cost you more than pride. He turned to leave, then stopped. And Frankie, yes, this offer doesn't stay open forever. The night everything feels fragile. That night, Frankie couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed, envelope resting on the table like it had weight, like it could tilt the room if it wanted to. He thought of his family, of his guitar, of the fear he hadn't voiced, that even with surgery, things might not return. He flexed his fingers. Pain flared. For the first time, he couldn't ignore it. A call he never expected. The next morning, Frankie's phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mr. Bell, a calm voice said. This is the clinic listed on your paperwork. We're confirming your pre-op consultation. Frankie froze. I didn't confirm anything. There was a pause. Our records show confirmation from your representative. Frankie's heart pounded. I'll call you back, he said, hanging up. He stared at the phone. Dean hadn't waited. Dean had acted. The choice tightens. Frankie marched down the hallway toward Dean's room, anger and fear tangled together. He knocked. Hard. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. A note slid under the door caught his eye. 3 words. I trust you. Frankie's knees weakened. Because trust was heavier than money. 10, the clock runs louder. 2 weeks. That was all the time left. 2 weeks to decide whether pride would win, or whether survival required surrender. Frankie sat down in the hallway, head in his hands, realizing something terrifying. This wasn't just about his hand anymore. It was about whether he believed kindness could exist without ownership, and whether he was brave enough to accept it. The night Dean Martin put everything on the line. Some decisions are made loudly, announced, celebrated, defended. The most dangerous ones are made quietly. Dean Martin made his at 2:17 a.m., sitting alone in a hotel room that suddenly felt too large for one man and one conscience. One when time stops asking. Frankie Bell didn't call. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not the day after. Dean never pushed, he never sent reminders, he never followed up. But time did. Every show after Chicago carried a subtle tension no one could name. The applause still came, the jokes still landed, the music still flowed, but something underneath had changed. Dean felt it. Frankie felt it more. Pain no longer waited for permission. Halfway through a show in Detroit, Frankie's fingers locked for a fraction of a second during a transition. The audience didn't notice. The band barely adjusted. But Dean did. And in that moment, Dean understood something clearly and painfully. Frankie was running out of choices. 2, the secret Dean never shared. What Frankie didn't know, what no one knew, was that Dean had already crossed a line he never crossed for anyone. Not family. Not friends. Not even himself. Dean had quietly rewritten part of the tour schedule. No announcements. No explanations. Cities were shifted, days rearranged. A block of time appeared on the calendar where none had existed before. To the industry, it looked like strategy. To Dean, it was insurance. Because if Frankie said yes, there would be no delay. And if Frankie said no, Dean would still refuse to let the clock win. 3, the injury that couldn't be hidden. It happened during rehearsal in St. Louis. A simple run, muscle memory, routine. Frankie reached. His hand failed him. The guitar slipped. The sound, wood against floor, was louder than any applause they'd heard all week. The room froze. Frankie stared at his hand like it had betrayed him personally. No one laughed. No one spoke. Dean walked over slowly, picked up the guitar and handed it back. Frankie couldn't meet his eyes. I'm fine, he said automatically. But his voice cracked. And that crack traveled through the room like a fault line. 4, the ultimatum that wasn't spoken. That night Dean didn't knock. He entered Frankie's room with the quiet authority of someone who already knew the answer. Frankie sat on the bed, hand wrapped, eyes hollow. Dean didn't sit. He stood. I'm canceling the next 3 shows, Dean said. Frankie's head snapped up. You can't do that. I already did. Dean, this isn't a discussion. Frankie stood, anger flaring through the pain. You're not risking your career for me. Dean's voice dropped. I'm not risking it, I'm choosing it. The words hung there, heavy, irreversible. Frankie shook his head. You don't understand what you're doing. Dean stepped closer. I understand exactly what I'm doing, he said. I'm refusing to let fear make this decision for us. For us, Frankie snapped. This is my body, my life. And your loss will echo through more than just you, Dean replied quietly. That silenced him. 5, the price of saying no. Dean took a breath. You walk away from this surgery, he said, and the tour ends early, not because you can't play, but because I won't pretend nothing's wrong. Frankie stared at him. You'd really do that? Yes. Why? Dean didn't answer immediately. Then he said the one thing Frankie never expected to hear. Because I failed once already, years ago, by staying quiet when someone needed help. I won't do it again. Frankie's anger dissolved into something colder. Fear. 6. The world pushes back. By morning, the industry noticed. Phones rang. Agents demanded explanations. Headlines hinted at tension behind the scenes. Dean's manager was furious. "You're creating rumors," he warned. "People will assume the worst." Dean shrugged. "Let them." Sponsors hesitated. Venues called. Contracts were re-examined. Every risk Frankie feared. Dean was absorbing it himself. Without complaint. Without credit. 7. Frankie breaks. That afternoon, Frankie sat alone in an empty theater, guitar resting beside him like an old friend he might be saying goodbye to. He flexed his fingers. Nothing. No response. The silence terrified him. For the first time he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in short, broken breaths that felt humiliating and necessary. He realized then what pride had cost him. Not dignity. Time. 8. The call that changed everything. Frankie picked up the phone. His hands shook, not from pain this time, but from surrender. "Dean," he said when the call connected. "I'm listening," Dean replied. There was a long pause. Then Frankie spoke the words that felt heavier than any refusal. "I'm scared." Dean closed his eyes. "So was I," he said, "the first time I trusted someone too." Another pause. Then, "I'll do it," Frankie whispered. "The surgery, I'll do it." Dean exhaled, the tension draining from his voice. "Good," he said softly. "Then we start protecting what matters." 9. The decision goes public. Within hours, the tour delay was officially announced. No details. No names. Just respect. The public speculated. Rumors flew, but something unusual happened. Instead of backlash, there was patience. Fans waited. And Dean didn't correct a single assumption. 10. The door Frankie walks through. The morning of the surgery, Frankie stood outside the clinic, envelope in hand. He finally opened it fully. Inside wasn't just payment. There was a note. No signature. Just 6 words. "Your music isn't finished yet." Frankie closed his eyes and walked in, the applause that came too late. Some miracles don't arrive with noise. They arrive slowly, measured in days, in silence, in the courage it takes to wait without knowing the ending. Frankie Bell learned that in a small recovery room, staring at a ceiling he hadn't noticed before, listening to the steady rhythm of a machine reminding him that he was still here. Still possible. 1. The longest silence. The surgery was over. That was all anyone said. No promises. No guarantees. The surgeon's words were careful, professional, restrained. "We did what we could, now we wait." Waiting was the hardest part. Frankie's hand lay wrapped and still, a stranger he wasn't allowed to touch yet. For the first time in his adult life, he couldn't play, not even quietly, not even in his head, without fear. Dean visited once. Just once. No flowers. No speeches. He sat in the chair beside the bed, hat resting on his knee. "How you feeling?" he asked. Frankie smiled weakly. "Useless." Dean nodded. "Good, that means you're resting." They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Before leaving, Dean placed the guitar case gently against the wall, close enough to see, far enough to wait. 2. The world moves on, or so it thinks. The tour delay stretched into weeks. Some fans grew restless. Some critics speculated. A few headlines questioned whether Dean Martin was slowing down. Dean didn't respond. He took the blame without explanation. Venues adjusted, schedules shifted, money was lost. Dean didn't count it. Not once. Because somewhere between quiet hallways and hospital rooms, he had made peace with the cost. 3. The first movement. Rehabilitation was brutal. Frankie learned humility the hard way, through exercises that felt embarrassingly simple and pain that felt insultingly complex. Lift. Hold. Release. Again. He failed more than he succeeded. There were nights he lay awake wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake, if pride would have been easier than hope. Then one morning, weeks later, the therapist placed the guitar in his lap. "Just hold it," she said, "nothing else." Frankie's fingers curled around the neck. They didn't scream. They didn't fail. They held. He cried then, quietly, deeply, because sometimes progress doesn't sound like music. Sometimes it sounds like breath returning. 4. Dean's rule. Dean never asked for updates. He never hovered. He had one rule. "When you're ready," he told Frankie once, "you walk back on stage like you never left. No announcements, no stories." Frankie frowned. "People will wonder." Dean smiled faintly. "Let them." 5. The night no one expected. The tour resumed in Las Vegas. A packed house, bright lights, familiar anticipation. The band walked out. Applause. Dean followed. More applause. Then quiet confusion. Because Frankie Bell wasn't there. Dean stepped to the microphone. He didn't explain. He didn't stall. He nodded once toward the wings. And Frankie walked out. No spotlight followed him. But the room shifted anyway. Frankie sat down, adjusted his guitar, took a breath. And played. The first note was clean. The second was warm. By the third, the audience felt it, not knowing why, only that something rare was happening. Dean started singing. And for the first time in months, he turned around before leaving the stage. Frankie met his eyes. And nodded. 6. The story comes out. The story didn't come from Dean. It never did. It came from someone else, quietly, respectfully, truthfully. No drama. No exaggeration. Just facts. And when the public learned what had happened, what Dean had risked, what he had paid, what he had never claimed, the reaction wasn't explosive. It was reverent. People didn't cheer. They reflected. 7. Frankie finally speaks. Weeks later, after a show, a reporter asked Frankie a simple question. Why did Dean Martin do it? Frankie thought for a moment, then said because he understood something most people forget. That talent is fragile, pride is heavy, and kindness doesn't need witnesses. 8. The legacy that lasts. Years later, people would talk about Dean Martin's voice. His timing. His charm.